Okay, well, let's go ahead and get started. I appreciate your patience last Thursday, and I did not get that lecture posted. It is sort of a separate lecture. I didn't get it posted till last night. It's about an hour long. It's over the autonomic nervous system. Honestly, when I was giving the talk, it felt just like my 105 talk. So there's really nothing new, right? There really isn't anything substantially new in that conversation about the autonomic nervous system, sympathetic versus parasympathetic. If you haven't listened to it yet, it's okay. But what we will be doing is comparing the autonomic nervous system, sympathetic and parasympathetic, with the endocrine system. That's kind of the big theme of this next exam. These two systems are primary in maintaining your homeostasis, right? That ideal balance of all systems is being largely maintained by your autonomic, sympathetic, parasympathetic, and your hormone balances, right? So that's kind of where we're going with this. Exams are available upstairs. Hillary, tomorrow is her long day. She's there till 6 o'clock tomorrow. So she'll be there from like 8 o'clock in the morning till 6 o'clock. Stop by, look at your exam. A few people have already done that. What I did is there were about 5 questions that I heard some mumbling about as we were leaving. And I looked back and I agreed. There were 5 questions that I had not discussed. One on glaucoma, a couple others. So I just threw 5 questions out, and then I added 10%. So the 5 questions and the 10%, there were 150 questions. So that was 20 points, if you will, that I added back out of 150. And I forget what the exact average was in the end. I posted it. It was respectable. There were a few students who struggled. Not too many, but there were a few that struggled. And let's talk. Okay, let's figure out a strategy if you were a student who struggled on this exam. I also want to make an announcement. I am the advisor for the Health Pre-Professional Club. It's a rather new club. We got it started last year. I had a few very motivated students last year, and we went off to Western Michigan and went to a med school prep day. We went over to Grand Valley. We went over to MSU. We did a lot of things. This year I haven't had many students showing interest in it, but I got an announcement the other day, and this looks really interesting. At the University of Michigan, on Tuesday the 24th of March, in the middle of the afternoon, it's an awkward time, but they are having this phenomenal health professional school expo. So all 7 med schools from the state and out of state, PA schools, dentistry, pharmacy, nursing, physical, occupational therapy, dental hygiene, speech pathology, genetic counseling, chiropractic, naturopathic, you name it. They're all going to be there and represent their schools well. So I'm hoping to head over there. I'll figure out class, but I'm hoping to head over there as the advisor, and I'm hoping maybe some of you would want to join us for that trip. So if you're interested at all in that, I'll try to send out an announcement about that. But it is a school day. I wish it wasn't. It's Tuesday the 24th of March. Okay, so just let me know if that's something you're interested in. And if not that trip, if you're just interested in the club. There hasn't been much activity this semester, but like I said, last year we did a lot of fun things. So, any questions? I'm also looking at the syllabus. And I realized we have a test next Tuesday, according to the syllabus, okay? And I don't feel good about that because I got that lecture to you so late, and I know that historically the hormones are new for most of you. This journey over chapter 16 right now will take some time to sink in, I think. So, looking at the calendar, looking at the syllabus, and I try so desperately not to do this. I hate changing test dates. But would you guys be offended if we moved it to the 19th? So rather than next Tuesday, it'd be a week from Thursday? Is that like a horrible thing to do?
I think that is a firm, absolutely.
Is that an okay? I mean, I know that I hate moving exams, right? There's always something. Yeah.
Are we going to be adding what we would have learned?
No new. It'll still be the autonomic nervous system, that quick little review. It'll be primarily hormones. And as much of chapter 6 on skeletal hormones that I can get to. So it's really not, it's no more. It would still be those same 3 chapters, and only as much of chapter 6 that I'm able to get to comfortably. And I wouldn't force it, okay? So we'll move it by 2 days, and I apologize. I usually don't like to do that. I also posted for you on Blackboard. If you look under Lecture 2, you'll find a handout. It's 10 pages long, But this handout is going to help you. And it begins by having you think about the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system and comparing and contrasting those things, and a little bit about the cranial nerves and their role in the autonomic nervous system. And then the rest of it is about hormones. And it goes page by page, basically gland by gland, what hormones are produced, what the target of that hormone is, and what that hormone does. And I think this will really help you as you're listening, as you're studying, as you're going through the book, as you're going through the notes. Grab this handout, print it out, and start filling it in. This will become, I think, very, very helpful for you. So I put that together for you. But like I said, I think to try to put all this information onto today and on Thursday and have you get it by next Tuesday is a little bit too ambitious. And I want to see you to be well and successful. I'm sorry, I have not put homework up yet. That's going to be my job tonight. Okay? I'm sorry? You're lost? You've been feeling lost. I thought maybe you'd enjoy the break, but I do appreciate, I've had 2 or 3 people say, there's no homework. And I'm like, yes, it's okay. I don't see any homework. My mastering's not working. It's okay. So I apologize again. I've just gotten beat up a little bit, and I hope you enjoyed the break, but the break's over. So I'll get some homework up there for you tonight on 14, autonomic nervous system, and 16 on hormones. And that will help you start putting this material together as well. Okay. Any other questions or concerns about just the busyness of our job today? Anything at all? It's just the introduction stuff. Any other comments or questions? Do go look at your exams, okay? It's very helpful. I was, to be honest, a little disappointed in the short answer portions. Okay, they took me hours and hours and hours to grade because they weren't very complete. Now, if I had asked you to write out a chemical synapse or the parts of an action potential without forewarning you, I would have been much less picky, right? But because I had given you that question, told you exactly what you were going to have to sketch out, I expect a little bit more, okay? So if in the future I give you, make sure you can do this, make sure you can do this. It's free points. If you just know it, put it down, do a good job on it. So when you look at your exam, you'll notice that there were probably only 5 or 6 people in the room who got all or most of the points. Okay, they were really well prepared and had thought about it, maybe had even practiced it. I mean, I would definitely suggest when you're told in advance, be able to draw this or draw out that you have actually run it through it at least once on a piece of paper. Okay, so I'll just give that little hand slap for those who need to hear that. Okay, I want to see you be successful in this class. Okay, so we're going to be talking about the nervous system, the endocrine system. Again, like I said, these are the 2 major systems that are maintaining largely your homeostasis. Every system's involved in some way, but these are the 2 big players. They work in some ways similarly, and in other ways they're very different. And that's, again, the compare and contrast that you'll be putting together in your mind. Similarly, they both use chemicals, right? Nervous system uses neurotransmitters. Endocrine system uses hormones. They have receptors, right? There's a cell that receives that signal. Hormones go to a cell that has a receptor for it. The autonomic nervous system, right? There's a neuron bringing that excitable signal. But either way, there's a chemical and there's a target that's involved. And there is some crossover. When we talk about sympathetic nervous system, usually we think epinephrine, right? Epinephrine makes you kind of higher alert for fight or flight. Well, epinephrine and norepinephrine, they are neurotransmitters, but they also travel through the blood as a hormone. So there is sort of a connection there between the way that the autonomic nervous system works and the endocrine system. And we'll be pulling all that together. Both are regulated by negative feedback. Remember, negative feedback, the more product you have, typically something feeds back and inhibits the overall reaction from happening. This is the classic example for hormones, right? If you think about sugar metabolism, you think about your blood sugar levels going up and down during the day. Negative feedback says that as your value of blood sugar gets further away from normal, that there's something that pushes it back toward normal, right? So that's usually a hormone in the case of blood sugar. So that idea of negative feedback, we know that one well. And both really are highly maintained, like I said, in keeping your homeostasis together. So here's a nice little chart. And in fact, on your handout sheet that I have for you, this is exactly where I start. I want you to be comfortable knowing these different mechanisms of communication. So some cells talk directly one to another, right? They talk side by side. They do so usually through gap junctions. Now, we've seen gap junctions between epithelial cells. We've seen gap junctions, well, in cardiac muscle, the intercalated discs. We'll talk more about those next time. But the intercalated discs really are gap junctions. They allow for communication side-by-side cells. Then there is paracrine. Paracrine is next door, right? What does para mean? Next to, right? So paracrine is one cell secretes, secrete. So one cell secretes to something that next door affects a neighboring cell. It doesn't have to be right next door, but a cell in the neighborhood, right, is affected by that chemical signal. That would be paracrine signaling. That signal is going to go not through the blood, but just out into the extracellular fluid, or just out into the interstitial fluid, just in the neighboring area around the cell. Then there's endocrine. Now this one's going to hop in the blood and take a ride. Right, so endocrine, endo, within the bloodstream, these hormones are going to travel. They can go to a far, far distant place, and they're going to travel throughout your entire body, usually, and pick up and affect something far, far away in another cell. And then compare that with synaptic communication, which is what we've seen in the nervous system, right, where you have a chemical released across a cleft and a receptor on the other side. So that's what we see with the nervous system and neurotransmitters. And endocrine is what we normally think of with hormones. So again, we're comparing and contrasting how these different systems do their job. So that's a big one. Compare and contrast the endocrine and the nervous system and how they get their job done. Now, let's talk about the different hormones. Hormones come in different types. There are going to be some amino acid derivatives. There are 20 amino acids, right, make up the proteins. And some of these neurotransmitters are very small molecules. They're basically just an amino acid-like molecule, maybe a small peptide, very, very small, 1 or 2 amino acids. This is going to be your thyroid hormone, as an example. Thyroid hormone is a derivative of an amino acid. Then there are a group of molecules called the catecholamines. The catecholamines include things you've heard of: epinephrine, norepinephrine, dopamine. Those are also neurotransmitters. They also can travel through the blood and act as hormones. We'll see how they kind of have a dual function. Those are the catecholamines. And then finally, there is melatonin. This is also a derivative of an amino acid. This is a derivative of tryptophan, one of the 20 amino acids. And melatonin, as I say these hormones, I'll try to get you thinking about these. Melatonin is released by the pineal gland. The pineal gland is a little tiny gland up in the thalamus area, and it's related to your 24-hour circadian rhythm, so kind of keeping your 24-hour clock in check. And some people take melatonin when they're traveling to help relieve jet lag, to help them reset their clock. Okay, so those are all amino acid derivatives. Thyroid hormone, your catecholamines, and melatonin, they all belong to the amino acids. The second group of hormone molecules are peptides. There are 2 or more amino acids put together, rather small proteins. Most of your hormones fall into this class. Okay, so this is going to be insulin as an example, and most of these are secreted as prohormones. In other words, there's a molecule made that is going to have to be modified before it becomes active. So the inactive form is first made, then it becomes activated through some process. And these can be, like I said, a few amino acids to rather small proteins. And examples also are glycoproteins, proteins with some sugar groups attached to them. So later on, when I talk about TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone, or LH, luteinizing hormone, or FSH, follicle stimulating hormone, those are all under this peptide hormone classification. Okay. The third group are lipids. These are going to be all derived from, most of them, from cholesterol. Remember, cholesterol is a lipid. And this is going to include, obviously, like testosterone and estrogen, right? Those hormones are all steroids, sex hormones. But there's also going to be a couple more that we'll learn about. One group are a whole group called the eicosanoids. And the eicosanoids include leukotrienes and prostaglandins. We'll talk more about these molecules. They have some really important effects in our body, the leukotrienes and the prostaglandins, and we'll get to those. This is kind of an introduction, getting you to think about the different classes, the different structures of hormones. Also under the lipid hormones are the steroids, like I mentioned, like your progesterone, estrogen, testosterone. Anything that ends in "-one", right? So we're going to see corticosteroids, we're going to see calcitriol. These will all be different hormones that are fat-based. They're steroid-based. And one of the big things we're going to be learning about is that if the molecule is lipid-based, what does it tell us about its ability to get through a cell membrane? It can go through it, right? So the lipid hormones are going to be able to be absorbed directly into the cell, whereas your protein hormones, they can't get into the cell without first coming in through a receptor. So we'll get to that story in a moment, but that's why we have to divide these hormones up into their different categories. It's going to tell us a little bit about how they're carried through the blood and how they interact with their target cells. Okay, so I'm not going to ask you to know the structures of any of these, but I think we can at least appreciate the amino acid derivatives. Again, the more times I tell it to you, that's the thyroid hormone, like T4, T3, we'll talk about that. Catecholamines, things like epinephrine, norepinephrine, dopamine, and melatonin derived from tryptophan. Those are all amino acid. Notice they're all very small, right? They're just one or two little amino acid molecules. There are slight variations on those amino acids, and they're very small. Then the peptide hormones, that's just the blue category. Nothing to show you there. They go from very small to large. And then the lipids, what you're going to see, that core right there of that molecule, not that you have to know it, but that's kind of what cholesterol looks like. Cholesterol is a multiple ringed structure, and the estrogens, the progesterones, the testosterones all look like cholesterol. They're all derived from it. They're just slight modifications of cholesterol. So your steroid hormones, and then your prostaglandins, and again the leukotrienes, which aren't shown here. Those are all lipid-based. They're going to be coming from the cell membrane, interacting with the cell membrane, and will go into the cell in a very different way than the protein hormones. Okay, so the endocrine system. When I say endocrine system, what comes to mind? What's the first thing that comes to mind? Glands, okay? So the actual glands that produce the hormones, okay? And when I say hormones, what hormones come to mind first? Does insulin come first to your mind as a hormone made by the pancreas, or maybe testosterone or estrogen or progesterone, the sex hormones come to mind? Those are some of the more commonly discussed ones. Regardless, so here are the glands, okay? The glands that you need to be able to recognize anatomically. And I think this won't be a problem. This is at least what we did last year in lab and did in lecture as well. So you should be able to, on a image, know where the hypothalamus is. We've been there, right? We saw it in the brain, under the thalamus, hypothalamus. Hanging from the hypothalamus was the pituitary gland. Okay. In the throat, right along the thyroid cartilage in the larynx, is the thyroid gland. Right behind it, I'm going to go out of order, I'm going to go anatomically. Right behind it is the parathyroid glands. These are attached to and are on the posterior side of the thyroid gland. I missed one up in the brain. There's the pineal gland. Okay, it's also up there further back from the thalamus. The pancreas we think of, right? There's quite a few hormones made by the pancreas. And then the adrenal glands, where are they? on top of the kidneys, right? Superior border of the kidney, and they're very, very important. Now, there are other organs that make a lot of hormones as well. Those are the big ones that I just mentioned. But we don't want to forget, the heart actually makes hormones. Didn't we already talk about it? Right? The natriuretic peptide, right? So we know the hormone does have the ability of producing hormones. It just isn't a major player, but very important function. Kidneys produce renin. We'll talk about renin. You'll hear renin or renin. We'll talk about that when we get to the urinary system a lot. The intestines themselves and the stomach itself, we are learning, are making lots of hormones. These hormones are not only involved with digestion, but we now know that there are hormones produced by the stomach and by fat cells that are also sending signals and interacting with the brain chemistry quite a bit. So there's a lot going on in fat and the digestive system that we're just now beginning to understand because of these hormones. The thymus, that is where many of your T cells, some of your immune cells are produced, but in adults, the thymus is involuted. It's very, very small. It's found in the thoracic cavity near the heart or on top of the heart. Not a major player in us as adults as far as hormones go. And then the reproductive organs, of course, we'll mention along the way: testosterone, estrogen, progesterone. So we just have a lot of new terms. Okay, so you're going to have to get organized. I'm telling you now, getting organized, and that's why this handout's going to be so important. Okay, so just take this along and read through along with the lecture, start filling this in, and this will become a very, very helpful tool. Okay, so the hypothalamus. Where is it again? Can you picture it? Below the thalamus, right? Right above the pituitary gland. We've already talked about some hormones produced by the hypothalamus. We mentioned ADH, right? ADH, antidiuretic hormone with fluid balance. So that one we've at least heard of. There's also, however, hormones from the hypothalamus that are involved with smooth muscle contraction. Haven't discussed that one yet. And the hypothalamus is a key player in affecting the anterior pituitary gland. Okay? So the anterior pituitary gland. The pituitary gland is actually two parts. The front part, the anterior pituitary, releases a lot, makes a lot, and releases a lot of hormones. The posterior part of the pituitary doesn't make anything, but it does store a couple important hormones that are made by the hypothalamus. So they're made in the hypothalamus, dumped in the backside in the posterior pituitary, and they're released as necessary. In fact, that was the story on ADH. Okay, ADH was made by the hypothalamus. I don't think I said it before, but it's stored in the posterior pituitary and then was released as needed. Okay, the pituitary gland, there are 6 hormones that we'll talk about that are here, and those hormones are going to be trophic or tropic. Tropic, that's the word I meant to say, tropic. Not tropic, it looks like tropic. We wish it was tropic, right? Sun, palm trees. Tropic means influencing. So we're going to see a lot of hormones released from the pituitary gland that are going to go elsewhere and influence other tissues in the body. So a lot of gonadotropic hormones. When you hear tropic hormone or tropin, it's a hormone that influences, like the gonadotropins would be what? It ends in IN, so it's a protein hormone. That tropic influences the gonads. So as we start unpacking these words, it'll make a lot more sense. There is a rhythm, there is a logic to this. There is, I promise you, but at first it's going to seem like, oh my goodness, there's too many little pieces to this puzzle. The thyroid gland, again, butterfly-shaped gland in the throat area. That's going to be very, very important for calcium regulation, as well as for your overall metabolism. Your overall metabolic rate is largely controlled by the thyroid gland. The adrenals. The adrenal gland is actually multiple layers. We're going to get to all these details, right? We got all this. This is all intro. There's multiple layers of the adrenal gland, and each of those layers will make different sets of hormones. So we'll see that there are hormones related to salt, some to mineral, and some to sex hormones. So we'll see that those hormones are all made in the adrenal gland. Very, very important. It's also the adrenal gland, though, that is activated in a fight or flight response. So when you are running from the bear, that's the example I always use, right? You're super scared, sympathetic nervous system's on overdrive, epinephrine's released. And that epinephrine, we'll see, comes from the adrenal glands. So we'll talk about that. Pancreas. When I say pancreas, you probably first think insulin. But there's about 6 different, well, at least 6 hormones that we'll probably mention along the way. The big one's insulin. Its counterpart is what? What's the opposite of insulin? Am I hearing glucagon? So glucagon does almost exactly the opposite as insulin. So we'll talk about those yin-yang kind of hormones as we go through this. But everything from the pancreas is involved with energy. Getting energy, using energy, timing of energy use. Those hormones are all about the digestive process. Pineal gland, a little pine cone-shaped gland, again, up in the brain, that releases melatonin, dealing with circadian rhythms, day and night pathways. Parathyroid, behind the thyroid, also important for calcium. And we'll mention how the thyroid and the parathyroid hormones work off from each other in maintaining calcium. And that's the chapter 6 story I want to tell you about. So if we get to it, in chapter 6, the next chapter talks about calcium regulation and bone formation and how these 2 sets of hormones are maintaining your calcium levels. So there is a rhyme and a reason as to the order of our chapters, even though I'm bouncing around the book a little bit. Again, the other organs that involve, that do produce hormones, the heart, that natriuretic peptide, the atrial natriuretic peptide, we already know that it's involved with blood volume. The thymus, again, these are minor, they're involved with the immune response. The digestive tract is making lots of hormones. The kidneys, the renin, R-E-N-I-N, that's made. The renin is involved with blood production and with calcium as well. And of course, the gonads are making a number of sex hormones that are involved with bodily functions. So here's just a good anatomical image to look at, right? To be able to name and identify each of these organs. I don't think that should be a problem, right? Knowing where each of these organs is found in the body. So finding those shouldn't be a problem. The big problem is going to be figuring out which hormones they make and then figuring out what these hormones do. So that's really the story here, keeping track of these hormones. The first time I went through this, I remember as an undergraduate, I felt really overwhelmed. And I think the handout sheet will help you. And then if you're a flashcard kind of person, that may help you as well. Okay? And on one side of the flashcard could be the hormone name, and on the back could be its action, or on the back could be what cells make it, something like that. But it's a lot of little tidbits, and there is a big story to be told. There is a puzzle to put it all together. But some people learn big stories first. Some people are better at the details, but you need to kind of get both. Okay, and we've got 10 days to do that. So hopefully this will all start coming together. So hormones are released for some reason. They're triggered to release. They're not just going out all the time. One of the characteristics of hormones is that they're in very low concentrations. So these molecules are released in very, very low concentrations at specific times. They travel through the blood. So every single cell in your body has access to these hormones, except only some cells have a receptor for that hormone. So if a cell doesn't have the hormone receptor, then it's as if that hormone does not exist, and that hormone can't affect that cell. Okay, so there has to be this receptor for the hormone to be recognized by the cell. So without it, no effect. Now, I don't want you to think, I know that our examples are going to be one hormone goes to a cell, and that cell has one receptor. That'll be kind of the way it's presented to you. Keep in mind, one cell could have hundreds of different sorts of receptors on its surface. So even though it's going to be shown as a very simplistic model, one hormone, one cell, one receptor, remember that it's like the intricacies of our nervous system. This isn't just one thing happening. There's a whole bunch of things happening at the same time. So multiple hormones can be affecting a cell at the same time. So there's two possible places for a receptor. One is on the membrane. Now, this would be what we probably think of. We think of a receptor, it's a protein, it's sitting in the plasma membrane. It is poking out of the cell membrane and can interact with the hormone. So the hormone would bind to the receptor, much like acetylcholine, right, would bind to the ligand-gated sodium channel that we talked about in the synaptic cleft, right? So that ACH in that case would be the hormone, just to give it an analogy, and the ligand-gated channel would be the receptor. So we've seen that kind of idea. These molecules are too big to go into the target cell. Did acetylcholine go into the next neuron? No, right? Some of you said it did. It doesn't, right? Acetylcholine did not go into the next cell. Acetylcholine was kind of broken up and erased, if you will, and taken care of by acetylcholinesterase. Remember that story? So these hormones can't get into the cell. They're not going to go into the cell. They're simply going to, quote, tickle the receptor. They're going to bind to the receptor, and this magical thing happens, right, where something now, a second messenger is going to be implemented inside the cell. So the hormone is the first messenger. It brought the signal, it tickled the receptor, it activated the receptor. And then inside the cell, there will be other activities, that will occur because that hormone bound. So the first messenger, right, so the hormone is the first messenger. Get that. The hormone is the first messenger, and inside the cell, what happens next, those molecules are called the second messengers. And there's a whole bunch of different ways we can talk about this. And honestly, I don't want to get too crazy about this. I kind of skimmed over it last time. It didn't seem to hurt anybody's feelings. I'm going to skim over it largely this time too. G proteins, okay? And that came up last time, right? G proteins, I told you that umami and the bitter receptors and the taste were G proteins, and I told you when those chemicals bound the receptor, something magical happened on the inside. Same kind of black box. I don't think we need to go into those details. But there's a second messenger molecule. Now, the examples of these second messengers are, and you'll hear about them a lot, cyclic AMP. So this is one of those second messengers. So as a result of the hormone activating the receptor inside the cell, cyclic AMP levels will go up. You'll hear about that molecule a lot in passing. And that usually has a lot of excitatory responses inside the cell. It can sometimes have an inhibitory effect as well. I don't want you to think that hormones only turn things on. Hormones can also turn things off, just like in the autonomic nervous system. Sympathetic doesn't always mean things are being turned on, and parasympathetic doesn't always mean that things are being turned off, right? There's like a rheostat. There's a balance going on here. So cyclic AMP is one of the important second messengers. Another one is calcium. You've already seen how important calcium was in the action potential, right? It came down the axon terminus, and what was at the terminus? In the membrane, there were voltage-gated calcium channels, right, that allowed calcium to come in. And then what did that calcium do? Caused something to happen. In the case of the action potential of the neuron, it caused the vesicles of neurotransmitters to bind out and exocytose, didn't it? So we've already seen that calcium can do special things inside cells. Same idea, the calcium would be considered a secondary message, a second message. Okay, so calcium has a lot of cool things that it does inside the cell. So here's the idea of this, and this is coming from your textbook. So again, a hormone up here. There's the receptor in blue, and there is the activation of a G protein. Again, I'm not going to go there, but what does the G protein do? It has the effect of either having an effect on cyclic AMP, and cyclic AMP will then, inside the cell, sometimes it will activate things, sometimes instead it will reduce things. It has either way, depends on what the story is. Or that G protein can affect the calcium levels And calcium almost always activates. So when the calcium is involved, it's going to activate certain things inside the cell. Typically, we say that hormones influence the metabolism of a cell. So what is metabolism? Metabolism is all of the reactions in the body, right? In a cell. So a cell's metabolism, all of the reactions. So a hormone influences the metabolism. It's going to somehow influence a subset of chemical reactions. It may turn things up, it may turn things down, but it's definitely going to alter the overall chemical reactions of the cell. So let's watch this little video. Are we going to hear it today? Okay, well, we'll read along together, okay? So we're just saying the introduction of the endocrine system, right? And we've got all these hormones, glands. The hormones are going to be released into the bloodstream, okay? Typically, they're going to go into the bloodstream and they're going to travel all around, right? The heart is pumping blood, but also the hormones. And it's only going to be, these hormones are only going to be picked up by cells that have a receptor. So here we go. There's a cell, there's a membrane, and there's the receptor, some very specific protein. Hormone binds, voila, something magical happens inside the cell as a result. Now, this is only showing a couple of receptors, but there could be hundreds and hundreds of receptors on this. Now, because this receptor got activated, other proteins inside the cell on the inside, like cyclic AMP, will be activated. So we're going to activate the cyclic AMP here. This molecule can't get in the cell, right? This molecule does not go into the cell at all. So now, once that hormone binds, there's hormone inside the cell. This G protein idea is going to get turned on. So this is the G protein, it's just inside. And as a result, it's going to make more of this cyclic AMP molecule. So I'm not going to get into the GTP story right now, but there is energy involved. GTP is like ATP. So these are not energy-free processes. There's energy involved in making these things happen. So once we're in there, we start amplifying this signal. So in other words, as long as that hormone is there, it can keep turning on this G protein story. So the longer the hormone's there, the more effect it has on the cell. These molecules are now the cyclic AMPs, okay, that are going to be made. And again, they're going to go and do other things within the cell. So the cyclic AMP molecules would be considered the second messenger. Now, where does that cyclic AMP molecule go? Well, it's going to do all sorts of things. Inside the cell, it's going to activate other enzymes. Some of those enzymes are called kinases. Kinases are proteins that put a phosphate group on another molecule. And usually that activates something. It's a lot better when you can hear it. I apologize. You'll get to listen to this one. If you just open up your PowerPoint on your computer and into the presentation mode, click on it. If you have the slides on the side, it won't go. So you have to have it in presentation mode. Now, this will keep happening. Cyclic AMP will keep being made inside the cell as long as the hormone is there. If the hormone is gone, then this stops. Okay, so we can turn this whole thing off pretty easily. Now that hormone is still in the blood, and notice that hormone did not get destroyed. That hormone does not get destroyed in the blood by binding to the receptor. It can be used for a while. So just like we had acetylcholinesterase in the synaptic knob, there are enzymes that will kind of wipe this cyclic AMP out of the way as well when the hormone is no longer there, and that will bring the cell back to its resting place. Sort of like, a neuron. It'll take away that stimulation. Now these are protein type receptors, right? Protein type hormones. They can't come in, so they bind on the outside, cause the cyclic AMP levels to rise, which then have an effect somewhere else in the cell. Okay? So we'll just keep watching and telling ourselves that story and convince ourselves what's going on inside the cell. Okay. Now, those are the protein hormones. They are water soluble. They are in the blood. They're traveling in the plasma. They bind to cell membranes through these receptors. The second type of place for hormone binding is inside the cell. Some hormones can go right through the cell membrane. What kind are those? The steroid, right? The steroid hormones, they can go right through the membrane because they themselves are phospholipid kind of molecules, and their receptor will be inside the cytoplasm or even all the way inside the nucleus. Whoa, that's a different model, right? We've never talked about that kind of thing before. So these steroid molecules don't have to activate a receptor on the outside of the cell. They can go right into the cell, and they're going to activate by hitting their receptor somewhere in the cytoplasm or even inside the nucleus. So they're going to go through the cell membrane and even through the nuclear membrane to their target. Okay, now these are going to be the lipid type hormones, the testosterones and progesterones, those type. They are specifically going to go into the cell and go straight to the nucleus, and they're going to directly influence gene transcription. Remember what transcription was? DNA being made into an RNA copy so that protein can be made. So if you have a hormone and it binds directly to the DNA and tells the DNA to turn on that gene, right? It's actually pretty fast. Okay, so this is really cool stuff. So you're actually going to go right into the DNA and turn on. Now, it doesn't always have to turn on. It could also turn off genes, okay? So don't always think it's activation. It could be telling a gene not to be made, right, in the regulation of things. So, for example, testosterone, we know, increases muscle mass. Okay, it happens at puberty, and as men start having lower T levels, they have less muscle mass, and one of the clinically relevant reasons for men to get testosterone enhancement might be to increase their muscle mass if they're starting to lose muscle mass. So that testosterone goes directly through the muscle membrane and goes directly to the genes that are involved with muscle proteins. So here's how this looks. I won't show the video of this one since I know it doesn't work now, but here's that steroid hormone. It's on the outside of the cell. Now it is going to be traveling through the blood, and I'll talk about this in a moment, but steroid hormones, because they're lipid, what do we know about lipids? Lipids don't mix with water. Water and oil don't mix. These hormones can't float through the plasma on their own. We'll see that they're being carried. They're going to kind of be disguised and carried through the bloodstream because these molecules would not be welcomed in a watery plasma environment. So we'll talk about that in a little bit. But this molecule is going to be brought to the cell, and rather than, it's going to jump off its carrier and go straight through the membrane of the cell. Like I said, sometimes these receptors are molecules inside the cytoplasm, but more often than not, that molecule is going to keep on going, go right through the nucleus, and directly bind to a protein that's on the DNA. And that is typically going to cause an activation of genes, increase the transcription of that particular gene, cause new proteins to be made, translation, and that's certainly going to alter the cellular response, isn't it? Okay, so directly to the DNA, turn on the genes, make new protein a little bit faster than working through the second messenger signal that we talked about a moment ago. So you need to keep track of what kind of hormones, right? Lipid or protein, and think about their mechanism. How are they going to be affecting the cell? Now the third group of hormones, I mentioned the thyroid hormones. They were kind of a special little category. And their receptors are either. So this one, the thyroid hormone is a little bit of an exception. it is transported across the cell membrane. It actually binds with, and this will make sense to you, should make sense to you, it binds with receptors in the mitochondria. What do the mitochondria do for your cells? Energy, overall energy metabolism. Thyroid hormone, I told you, was largely involved with your overall basal metabolism. So people have low thyroid levels, right, don't have much energy. When you give them thyroid supplements, all of a sudden they've got more energy. Why? Because one of the things the hormone does is directly target the mitochondria. Ooh, more energy, more ATP. Okay, so it's a pretty cool thing. And the thyroid hormone also goes straight to the nucleus. So it's got two receptors, one in the mitochondrion for ATP and one in the nucleus that also affects other proteins that are involved with metabolism. So just to see that cartoon lay it all out. Thyroid hormone, small hormone, just a couple of amino acids. It is able to go straight through because even though it's a, this is the exception, even though it's a small amino acid-like molecule, it is hydrophobic enough to go straight through. So that's kind of a combination. It's small enough and it can go straight through the membrane. And again, has receptors in the mitochondria for ATP synthesis and goes right to the nucleus to turn on gene expression related to energy. Very, very cool hormone. So look over those receptors. What's the first messenger? The first messenger is always the hormone itself. The second messenger is that hocus pocus box, things like cyclic AMP and calcium that do the work inside the cell once the hormone has bound. Okay, so the rest of this is going to be pretty much name that gland, name the hormones, figure out what the hormones are doing. Okay, I'm going to focus on the big things that these hormones do. There are a lot of nitty-gritty things that they do as well. I'm going to try to focus on the big ideas. I want you to walk away from this unit a couple weeks from now. When someone talks about a particular hormone, you'll at least be, okay, ding, 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 ding. What is that hormone doing in the body? What's the big story for that hormone? What tissues make it? What tissues respond to it? So that's our big take-home lesson. Okay, so let's start with the hypothalamus. It's kind of the center of your endocrine system and the center of your autonomic nervous system. We'll see that the hypothalamus is largely in control of both of these systems. It has the highest, it's the king of the endocrine system. And we're going to see that it integrates nervous system and endocrine. Now there's three mechanisms here. Number one, there are neurons. Remember I told you that the hypothalamus makes a couple of hormones? And those hormones are stored where? In the posterior pituitary. At first you might think, well, okay, so the hormones are made in the hypothalamus. And when you think of hormones, how do you think about hormones traveling? Through the blood, right? But this is a really unique interaction. The hypothalamus actually has neurons that release these hormones in the posterior pituitary. So rather than the hypothalamus making the hormone and it travels through the whole body and somehow makes it back to the posterior pituitary to be stored, it simply sends a signal from the hypothalamus. There are neurons that go right down. The hypothalamus is really close to the posterior pituitary, really, really close. And those neurons dump out this hormone. That's kind of weird, isn't it? We've got a neuron dumping out a hormone. So again, we see this overlap, this crossing over of the systems. And those two hormones that are being made by the hypothalamus but sent down to the posterior pituitary, ADH, we've seen it before, we've talked about ADH before, involved with water regulation, and oxytocin. Okay, oxytocin, you've heard of this one before. Oxytocin is the same as Pitocin or similar. And we know it's involved with childbirth, it's involved with uterine contractions, it's involved with milk let down for suckling of the newborn, but it also has roles in the male as well. We'll talk more about that. Now, it tells you specifically what nuclei are involved. Those are the little areas of the hypothalamus where these hormones are produced. So the hormone produces those two hormones, ADH and OT, oxytocin. All these hormones have abbreviations. Get used to them. You can use them, okay? So ADH, antidiuretic hormone, OT, oxytocin. You'll see them. You'll see me use them. You want to be able to know what the abbreviations are as well. They are fine to use on your exam, right? So it's the same language. We're talking the same language. The second thing the hypothalamus does is secretes a lot of regulatory hormones. If you see a hormone and in its name you see inhibiting or regulating, it's always made by the hypothalamus. So there's going to be a whole bunch of hormones made by the hypothalamus, things like prolactin inhibiting hormone or something regulating hormone. When you see that extra word in there, regulating or inhibiting, you know it came from the hypothalamus. And then finally, the hypothalamus is going to speak directly with the adrenal medulla. Now, when I say medulla or medulla, what does that mean to you? Medulla versus cortex. The adrenal gland is just like the brain or the kidney, right? It has an outer layer called the cortex. It has an inner mass called the medulla. So the hypothalamus is going to speak directly to the medulla, the adrenal medulla. It's a long way away. And the adrenal medulla is going to be releasing epinephrine and norepinephrine in a fight or flight response. So we see the three things that the hypothalamus does. Oxytocin and ADH, a bunch of regulating hormones, and speaks directly with the adrenal medulla to spit out epinephrine for a sympathetic surge. Those are three very important ideas. Let's take a look at this. Here is the hypothalamus up in this area, and here's that little stalk down to the pituitary. The pituitary has two halves, the anterior and the posterior. They're totally different. The posterior is made of nervous tissue. The anterior is made of epithelial glandular tissue. So the posterior is really just an extension of the brain. The anterior is really more of a secreting gland. Okay, so they're just two things in close proximity, but they're really derived from totally different parts of your development. So number one, hypothalamus makes ADH and OT. Now look at this. I know it's hard on these images. It's showing a green structure here that goes straight down. This is the posterior pituitary in the back. These are neurons. And these neurons send their signals down, and their axon terminals release ADH and oxytocin. Okay, so it's all nerve ending over on the posterior pituitary. Okay, so we have a neuron releasing what we would think would be a neurotransmitter, but this is now a hormone that it's releasing, stored there in the posterior pituitary. The second thing that it's doing is now, these are those two nuclei, those two regions of the hypothalamus, and they are going to be sending down hormones to the anterior pituitary. Those are the regulating hormones, okay, the regulating hormones. And then finally, there's another part of the hypothalamus that directly speaks to the middle of the adrenal glands, the medulla. And that's where the epinephrine and norepinephrine would come from. Okay. This connection between the hypothalamus and the pituitary is called the hypophyseal portal system. The adrenal gland, the pituitary gland is sometimes called the neurohypophysis or the adrenal hypophysis. So the posterior pituitary, nervous tissue, is called the neurohypophysis. So here's that word right there, hypophysis. The posterior, I told you, was nervous. So neurohypophysis is the posterior. Adreno or adeno hypophysis is the anterior pituitary. There is a set of capillaries, blood vessels, that go directly between the hypothalamus and the pituitary. And those regulating hormones travel through this unique blood portal system. It's a set of capillaries. In other words, when the hypothalamus releases a regulating hormone, again, it doesn't have to travel all the way through the body and come back to the pituitary gland. It has a direct blood connection. So we have a direct nervous connection, and we have a direct blood connection, blood vessel connection. It's really cool, separate little blood system, and that's what's called the portal system. These are fenestrated capillaries. Remember fenestrated capillaries? Fenestrated capillaries are capillaries with medium-sized holes in them, openings in them. Fenestra means window. So capillaries with windows in them. This is important because these are hormones. These are kind of big molecules, and they've got to get into the capillary and back out of the capillary. So these capillaries better be fenestrated with holes big enough for these molecules to enter and leave the blood flow. Okay. So again, this is the key. Why do we need this extra blood connection? So that the hormones from the hypothalamus aren't being diluted by going into your general circulation. They go directly to the anterior pituitary. So here is that blood flow section. So again, coming from the hypothalamus, here's this own little set of blood vessels coming down to the anterior pituitary. And that's that portal system. Portal system. Two classes of regulating hormones. I've already mentioned this. If it has the word releasing in it, did I say regulating or releasing? Releasing, bad. They are regulating hormones, sorry, if they have the name releasing in them or the name inhibiting in them. Okay, sorry, they're regulatory hormones. If they have the name releasing or inhibiting in their name, you know they came from the hypothalamus. Okay, so we'll see a couple of these IHs and RHs. So that's the big story on the hypothalamus, okay? Three important things. Releases some hormones via nerves to the posterior pituitary, ADH and OT. By the portal system, it releases a bunch of hormones down to the anterior pituitary. They're all going to be called releasing or inhibiting hormones. And it directly talks to the adrenal medulla to upregulate epinephrine in a fight or flight response. So check hypothalamus. Okay, we're kind of going through gland by gland, key hormone, and I'll be telling you little stories, and your job is going to be kind of putting it together. Pituitary gland. I've already mentioned it. It's called the hypophysis. There's two parts. It's small. Do you remember where in the brain the pituitary gland is protected? What's the bone marking? The sella turcica. Remember that little Turk's saddle? That is a part of the sphenoid bone. That's not that very big, right? It's about the size of a pea. So the pituitary gland hangs down, is protected by that sella turcica. There are 9 hormones that are released, 7 from the anterior and 2 from the posterior. Well, we've already said the 2 from the posterior, right? The neurohypophysis, the posterior pituitary, releases what 2 hormones? ADH and oxytocin, right? They were made by the hypothalamus but stored and released from the posterior pituitary or the neurohypophysis. The anterior pituitary is going to release 7 different hormones. Those are all, again, tropic. They're all going to influence other things. So the hypothalamus is the king. The hypothalamus is going to release or inhibit the anterior pituitary to release other hormones that are then going to influence other tissues in your body. So it's a hierarchy. Okay? So it's a sequence. It's a complex sequence of chemical events that will occur. Now, all 9 of these work through that cyclic AMP second messenger system. So they all have that in common. In other words, they're all proteins, right? Right? Do you recognize if they all work through cyclic AMP, they must all bind to a receptor on the outside of the cell. None of them are steroidal. None of them are lipid-like. So let's just look at this again. We've seen it, but now the pituitary gland is sitting protected in the sella turcica. Again, the back of it is the posterior pituitary. Does the posterior pituitary make anything? No. All it does is store the 2 hormones from the hypothalamus, OT and ADH. The anterior pituitary makes 7 hormones. The instructions to make those 7 came from the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus will talk to the anterior pituitary through that portal blood system and tell it to make or to inhibit certain hormones. So let's go through some of these hormones. The hormones of the anterior pituitary. First one, TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone. You tell me, where's this hormone going? Thyroid, right? So they make sense. So the anterior pituitary is going to release TSH. And we've already said to ourselves, we know, hey, this thing's going to go into the blood and travel to the thyroid. And we get that. It's going to then tell the thyroid to make thyroid hormone, right? The T4 that I briefly mentioned that then goes straight into the mitochondrion and into the nucleus to affect energy metabolism. Why did it release TSH? Why did the anterior pituitary release TSH? Because the hypothalamus told it to. And the hypothalamus sent down TRH. Don't you hate it? Right? TRH. What is it? Thyroid releasing hormone. Okay, so the hypothalamus puts out TRH, tells the anterior pituitary to put out TSH. It goes to the thyroid, tells the thyroid to put out thyroid hormone. Now, this seems really complex, and it is. And doctors spend their practice dealing with hormone levels and all of this. But remember we talked about how the nervous system, there's 3 sensory neurons that go up with signals, and there's 2 motor neurons that come down most of the time. And that the reason, although it seems like it would take a lot longer for the signals to travel one to the next and go through the synaptic vesicles and all that, what was the main reason that the body has all these different neurons in sequence? It was slower, but it gave the nervous system more control. Right? There's more fine-tuning, there's more control if you have multiple signals. Same thing is true here. Keep that in mind. As the hypothalamus releases the hormone, as it influences the anterior pituitary, as it then influences its target organ, there's a lot of control in here. It's complex, but the more steps, the more places where the body can intercede and can control fine-tuning. So keep that in mind as you think through these different pathways. These are called axes. Axes. So you hear about the hypothalamus, pituitary, thyroid axis. So that's what I'm describing right now. Okay, I'm describing the hormones that are involved with the thyroid. Hypothalamus, TRH, down to the anterior pituitary, TSH, down to the thyroid. You would hear that called the hypothalamus, pituitary, thyroid axis. If you hear that terminology, they're talking about the hormones that are involved in this pathway. Okay. Again, if there's plenty of thyroid hormone, it'll send signals back to the anterior pituitary, back to the hypothalamus and say, no, we got plenty of hormone right now, and shut them down by negative feedback. The second one, adrenocorticotropic hormone. That's a mouthful. ACTH is a lot easier, but know what they mean. ACTH, where's it going? Break it down. Adrenocorticotropic. Tropic is going to influence the adrenal cortex. Okay, so this is the hormone. It's going to leave the anterior pituitary, head toward the adrenal gland, specifically to the outer layer, the cortex. These are also called the corticotropins. Okay, and we're going to see that it releases we haven't talked about the adrenal gland yet, but the adrenal cortex releases steroid hormones. Okay, so the ACTH is going to head down to the adrenal cortex and there release a whole bunch of steroid hormones. Things like aldosterone, things that end in "-one". You'll hear about them later. What told it to do so? Who told the anterior pituitary to release ACTH? The hypothalamus, when it sent corticotropin releasing hormone. Okay, so CRH triggers the anterior pituitary to make ACTH. Is now going to trigger down to the adrenal cortex, and they're going to make like 25 different hormones down there that we'll get to. There are gonadotropins. This is a group of hormones made by the anterior pituitary. They're going to regulate the what? Gonadotropins are going to proteins that influence the gonads. These are going to be heading to the testes and the ovaries, and they're going to influence the production of estrogen, progesterone, testosterone. Okay. Same idea. They were released, right? These gonadotropins were released in response to what? Gonadotropin releasing hormone. Are we seeing the pattern? It's really not horrible. We just got to put it together. Now, what are these hormones? There's a couple of these hormones that are called gonadotropins. The first one is FSH, follicle stimulating hormone. When you hear this word, you think, oh, that must just be a female hormone, right? And it's somehow going to the ovaries to influence the formation of follicles, the egg, maturing of the egg during the ovarian cycle. And that's true, but males also make FSH, and that FSH is important in promoting the maturation of sperm. So this is not a female-only hormone. And we'll see later on that it's inhibited by a hormone called inhibin. That makes sense. Inhibin inhibits, and it inhibits this FSH signal. We'll talk about that more really when we get to the reproductive systems at the end. The second gonadotropin is luteinizing hormone, LH. Again, the first thought you may have is it must go to the ovary and have something to do with the corpus luteum. And that's true. It does, again, have a lot to do with the ovarian cycles. The FSH and the LH both spike right before ovulation. We'll talk more about that later on. So that's true. They do induce ovulation, but in males, they also turn up the Leydig cells. The Leydig cells are the testosterone-producing cells in the testes. So they have a function in the male as well. So you're grabbing all this, right? You're grabbing, or at least you're thinking about it, and then you're going to transfer. If you think this is helpful, use it. Transfer, who makes it, where's it going, what's it doing, right? And it's a lot of little tidbits to remember. The fifth hormone made by the anterior pituitary is growth hormone. We've probably heard of this one. If a person has, well, I should say, first of all, this is going to it's going to work overall in growth. It's going to be a major hormone before and up through puberty. Okay, and this is going to kind of dive down a little bit. It's going to be really involved with early development and accelerating protein synthesis. It's going to be regulated, yin-yang, by two hormones coming from the hypothalamus. Makes sense? Growth hormone inhibiting and growth hormone releasing. So these two hormones are working back and forth to balance the growth hormone levels. This hormone, I'll talk about it later on, but if this hormone's out of whack, or if your pituitary gland has a tumor, oftentimes this is the hormone that will be released in excess during that tumor growth. And these are the giants, right? The giantism. So if you watch any of those TLC medical shows and you got the 7-foot giant, they usually have a tumor in their pituitary gland. And that pituitary gland is overproducing growth hormone, and it doesn't shut down like it's supposed to. And they just keep on growing. Okay. So we'll see that as, at the end of this, we'll try to put together some of the common endocrine disorders where these hormones are out of whack and what's the medical consequence of that. Now, where does this growth hormone go? It does go to the bones. It does go to your general tissues. It also, though, goes to the liver and makes another molecule called somatomedins. And these are also going to stimulate growth, and another growth factor called insulin-like growth factor. All I want to say is that growth hormone does lots of things. It's all involved with growing. It's all involved with upregulating muscle and bone and overall growth. It also, though, affects epithelial cells. It does break down adipose. So when you're growing, you need energy, so the fat is broken down. And it also breaks down glycogen from the liver. So just think, what would be necessary to grow? We need more energy, and we need to grow these tissues. The sixth hormone from the anterior pituitary is prolactin. Again, this sounds like a female-only hormone. It is involved with milk production, prolactin, prolactose, pro-milk production. So it definitely does have a lot to do with mammary gland stimulation and development. But it also has a role in sperm production, so guys have PRL as well. Okay, so we've got PRL. And again, it is going to be, this one's going to be inhibited by the hypothalamus. So there is no prolactin releasing, but there is a prolactin inhibiting hormone that will shut this down from the hypothalamus. The last one, melanocyte stimulating hormone. Question?
If it doesn't have
Releasing hormone?
releasing hormone, does that mean it just constantly?
It's always constantly on, right. It's always constantly on, and the hypothalamus would only interfere by telling it to shut off. So there's always a little bit going on. So you're thinking, okay, what's going on here? I'm not always pregnant. I'm not always lactating, right? So it has other purposes. These hormones don't have one purpose, right? They don't just have one thing they do. Okay.
So then if you weren't pregnant, then you would constantly be inhibiting. Is that the case?
In part, yes, at times. Yeah, the question is, would you be mostly inhibiting it during non-pregnant times? Yes, that's another way of thinking about it. Absolutely. But there is some prolactin being produced all the time. Now, the last one, melanocyte stimulating hormone, is going to go where? To your skin, right? The melanocytes are your pigment-producing cells, and they're going to increase melanin production. Doesn't really have an effect during our lifetime, during our adult lifetime. This is the only hormone made by the AP, by the anterior pituitary, that isn't released throughout your life. This one is released a lot during development, during the formation of our body and our skin and our integumentary system, and then pretty much done. Okay, so this one is sometimes is even said it's not a tropic enzyme. It does influence the melanocytes, but it doesn't have much effect, and it's not in our circulation as an adult. So 9 hormones made by the anterior pituitary, 9 by the pituitary, 2 by the posterior pituitary, 7 by the anterior pituitary, and you should be able to, as I go through this, think about them. So TSH, going to the thyroid, ACTH, going to the cortex of the adrenal gland, the gonadotropins, both FSH and LH, going to the gonads, growth hormone going to the musculoskeletal system in general, prolactin, mammary gland, and the one that goes to our skin only really during development, MSH. Then, let's go backwards. Let's go back to the posterior pituitary. The ADH, we've already talked about it. Now, ADH, if you look in some older literature, and even some current literature, you'll see it instead called vasopressin. Okay? So what do we know about ADH? It regulates fluid levels, and it has an influence on blood pressure. Vasopressin, right? So they had another name for this molecule. It had vessel, pressure. So you see where it kind of got its name historically, the vasopressin. So if you see VP or vasopressin, in your mind, kind of remind yourself that's the same as ADH. Just another name, different generation. And we've already seen that the ADH was released and monitored by those osmoreceptors. So that's an old story. We know that story a little bit, and we know that it affects the kidneys. Right? So ADH will go to the kidneys and tell you to retain water or to decrease your urination, and as a result, your blood pressure would increase. And I think I've mentioned along the way that ADH is inhibited by alcohol. So alcohol, therefore, is a diuretic, right? So if alcohol inhibits the anti-diuretic, 2 negatives, right? So alcohol becomes a diuretic because it inhibits the body's ADH production. The other one was oxytocin. We've heard of this, most of us, the Pitocin idea, and this one is involved with, it comes from a term meaning swift birth. We know that it definitely triggers and increases uterine contractions during childbirth, and it also is involved with releasing the milk. So think anything that squeezes the uterus, it squeezes the glands of the mammary glands, projects the milk, and has other features we think, other roles we think in sexual arousal, but those are not well established. So when you think of the posterior pituitary, two, not made there, but released there, both made in the hypothalamus, but released from the posterior pituitary as needed. Okay. Any thoughts so far? How are we doing? How many more hormones are there? A few more, okay? So this is the beginning of it. Any thoughts so far? So far we're just kind of going through a story, aren't we? Just a collection of facts. These hormones are going to work through negative feedback. We've already talked about that. We know that that is true, that when something starts to go, what does negative feedback mean? Right? Negative feedback is the idea that, right, we're keeping something at some reasonable set point. And as that value, let's say it's blood glucose, as blood glucose goes up, there's going to be a hormone, insulin, that's going to push the blood sugar back down. And when it gets too low, something's going to push it back up, and that hormone is going to be glucagon. That's just an example, kind of a classic example of negative feedback. So the body is always trying to keep things at a set point, at some reasonable average. And there's a mechanism by which it pushes it back. So that's one way of thinking about negative feedback. So hormones do this all the time. This is their claim to fame. So let's take a look at this idea. Releasing hormones from the hypothalamus, go down to the pituitary gland and do what? Tell them to release a hormone. That hormone travels to the target organ and tells it to release a hormone. Right? So we've got three hormones here, three different places. And once you've got plenty of this hormone, what does it do? It feedback inhibits and says, you know what, we've got plenty. And it goes back and shuts down both of these places. So the negative feedback goes back and says to the anterior pituitary, we got enough, thank you. It goes back to the hypothalamus and also says, we've got enough, thank you. It is in this constant balancing act. Now, this is a nice little table. It reminds you that TRH, made by the hypothalamus, works on the anterior pituitary to release TSH, works on the thyroid gland to make the thyroid hormone. So this is kind of a nice table to put it all together for the first time. Negative feedback. Sometimes there are releasing and inhibiting hormones involved. And so that makes sense when there's both. So growth hormone, prolactin, there are molecules that push each of them. There's a prolactin releasing, and there is in places a prolactin inhibiting factor as well. We'll get to that a little bit later. So there's this yin-yang kind of thing. Let's take a look at this example. So growth hormone inhibiting hormone, growth hormone releasing hormone, they're both having an effect on the ability of the growth hormone to release growth hormone. So again, they're both working yin-yang to increase it. If you had plenty of the products, then it would go back and do what? If you had plenty of the products, it would go back and inhibit the release. If you didn't have enough of the product, it would go back and stimulate, okay? Or actually, this would do both. When I take this back. If you had plenty of the product, let me clean this up. If you had plenty of the product, it's going to go back and inhibit the release and stimulate the inhibitor. So you got both of these things happening. Again, all these different players are creating multiple layers of control. Hormones are not something you want to play with. If you have a rather common endocrine disorder like diabetes or something, then most general physicians can deal with that. OBs are pretty good at dealing with, GYNs are good at dealing with some female hormone issues. But if you have something a little bit more than the common hormone imbalance, you really want to go see an expert. This stuff gets really complex, and when you tweak with one system, it has multiple downhill effects from other systems. So again, what we're seeing is that there's many, many layers of control. And the same story is here with the PRL. So here's this big picture. Let's make sure we finish this up. So we've got the hypothalamus. We keep saying it. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 different hormones. Okay, they all have releasing or inhibiting in their name. They all influence the hormones made by the anterior pituitary. And there were 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 of those. And then there were the 2 released from the posterior pituitary. So that's a big part of it. Now, that's the big king, the hypothalamus, and the major releasing gland, the anterior pituitary. Now we're going to start just looking at the other ones. Let me just get through the thyroid gland and maybe the parathyroid, and then we'll finish up the other ones next time. There's a lot of slides here, but the guide will help you. Yeah, I think next Thursday will work, right? I'm just thinking ahead. I'll probably finish up the endocrine story next time on Thursday, and then next Tuesday we can talk a little bit about skeletal muscle and how those hormones specifically involve skeletal formation. So I think we'll be okay. So the thyroid, where is it again? Throat, little butterfly-shaped gland. The 2 parts of the butterfly are connected by what's called the isthmus, the narrowing little border or bridge between the 2 butterfly wings. Pretty easy to palpate. Very dark red color. This is true of many of your endocrine glands because there's a lot of blood flow, right? These glands are receiving signals through the blood. They are sending signals through the blood. So one of the characteristics of your endocrine glands is that they're usually quite red. There's a lot of blood flow going through these organs. So again, we see the butterfly shape, and this narrow region is the isthmus. It's right below the thyroid cartilage. So right below the Adam's apple, if you have an Adam's apple, guys, right below that would be the thyroid gland. Histologically, when you cut into the thyroid gland, you're going to find follicles. These are a very distinctive looking tissue. You're going to see big, hollow spheres, and around the outside edge will be simple cuboidal epithelium. The other place we saw simple cuboidal epithelium was the kidney. And in the lab, even last semester, some of the slides for simple cuboidal weren't of the kidney, they were instead of the thyroid gland. It's just a clean example of this epithelium. Inside that follicle is what's called a colloid. It's really a bunch of proteins. It's like a gel, okay, a colloid. And there is where we make and make a protein called thyroglobulin. Now what thyroglobulin does is it's going to help us transport and carry around the thyroid hormone. Again, lots and lots of capillaries. In the thyroid, there are a couple different types of cells. One cell, it was named C cells because they are, quote, clear, but I love them because the C cells make a hormone, starts with the letter C, calcitonin. Okay? So the C cells of the thyroid. So when we think about the thyroid hormone, yes, we think about energy metabolism, but there's another very important hormone made here that's all about calcium, and that's calcitonin. And we're going to see how it does yin-yang with parathyroid hormone, if not today, then next time. So if you look at the thyroid, this is the colloid. It's like a big gel of protein, and you can see that beautiful single layer of simple cuboidal cells going around it. The C cells are here. They're outside the colloid. These cells outside. They're making the calcitonin. Okay, we'll finish up with the thyroid. We'll get through the pancreas. We'll get through the adrenal cortex and the adrenal medulla next time, I do believe. And if there's any questions, come see me. Please go look at your exams when you have a chance, and make sure you print out the guided reading to help you, and look for the homework tonight. And when you get a chance, listen back to that autonomic nervous system presentation, and have this in front of you when you do it. Have the handout with you when you do it to help you also through that presentation.